1670s, somewhere in the Caribbean. A Spanish treasure ship has just been captured, and its cargo hold is filled with gold. The pirates tear open the wooden crates, laughing as they begin dividing their prize. For men who have spent years risking their lives at sea, this should have been the moment everything finally paid off. Then something goes terribly wrong. One man collapses, another begins screaming. Within moments, the excitement turns to panic. The same men who were fighting over the treasure are suddenly desperate to get away from it. But what exactly had they found? A terrifying story would later claim that this was no ordinary Spanish gold. It was Aztec gold, taken from sacred temples during the Spanish conquest and carried across the Caribbean by generations of treasure ships. And according to the legend, anyone who possessed it would eventually pay the price. But was the Aztec gold really cursed? Or was the truth behind the legend even darker? To answer that, we have to follow the gold backward, long before it reached the hands of a pirate. In 1519, Hernán Cortez arrived in Mexico with roughly 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a small number of cannons. His expedition eventually reached Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, a vast city built on an island in Lake Texcoco and connected to the mainland by massive stone causeways. The city may have been home to hundreds of thousands of people, with enormous markets, towering temples, palaces, and ceremonial centers that seemed almost impossible to the Europeans who had crossed the Atlantic. But it was the gold that captured their attention. The Spanish encountered golden masks, animal figures, ceremonial objects, ornaments, and enormous discs associated with Aztec religion. The Spanish had encountered wealth on a scale they had never seen before. To the Aztecs, however, gold carried a very different meaning. It was not simply a commodity to be traded or accumulated. It was associated with the sacred world and appeared in religious ceremonies, temple decorations, offerings, and objects connected to the gods. That difference would become critical once Cortez realized how much of it existed inside the city. Montezuma II, the Aztec ruler, initially received the Spanish and presented Cortez with elaborate gifts, hoping perhaps to manage these strange newcomers through diplomacy. Among those gifts was gold, including a massive golden disc associated with the sun god, Tonatiuh. But the gifts had the opposite effect. Instead of convincing the Spanish that they had seen enough, they showed them just how much wealth might still be hidden inside Tenochtitlan. And from that moment on, the gold became more than something the Spanish admired. It became something they wanted to possess. Cortez eventually took Montezuma hostage and began demanding more treasure. Gold started flowing into Spanish hands. Religious objects were stripped from their original settings, melted down, and transformed into portable bullion. The intricate shapes that had once represented gods, animals, and sacred symbols disappeared inside furnaces, leaving behind something the conquistadors could weigh, divide, and eventually transport across the ocean. And according to the traditions that later surrounded this treasure, that was the moment the real danger began. The Spanish believed they were turning sacred objects into wealth. The Aztecs had every reason to see it as something much more serious, the destruction of objects that were never meant to be removed from their sacred world. But if the gold really carried a curse, the Spanish would not have to wait long for the first terrifying example. The night the gold became a death trap. By 1520, the situation inside Tenochtitlan had become impossible for Cortez and his men. The Spanish were surrounded, the city was turning against them, and the treasure they had accumulated was becoming increasingly difficult to protect. Eventually, Cortez ordered his men to escape the city under cover of darkness. What happened next became one of the most infamous episodes of the conquest. On the night remembered as La Noche Triste, the Spanish attempted to cross the causeways leading away from Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs had removed bridges from several gaps, and once the escape began, warriors attacked the retreating soldiers from the darkness and from canoes surrounding the causeways. The Spanish were carrying weapons, equipment, horses, and something else they were unwilling to abandon: the gold. Some soldiers had packed pieces of bullion into their clothing and equipment. Others carried as much treasure as they could manage. In the chaos, men and horses fell into the water, and soldiers weighed down by their equipment struggled to escape from the gaps in the causeways. Many drowned, and this is where the later curse legend becomes so powerful. The men had entered the Aztec capital searching for wealth. They had stripped sacred places and carried away the gold. Now, while trying to escape with that same treasure, some of them disappeared beneath the water. From a purely physical perspective, there was nothing supernatural about it. Heavy equipment made swimming more difficult. Darkness, rain, combat, and broken causeways turned the retreat into chaos. But imagine how the story would have been remembered by the people who witnessed it. The strangers had taken the gold. The strangers had been warned about disturbing sacred places, and then the gold itself helped drag some of them to their deaths. Whether anyone at the time actually described this as a supernatural curse is another question, but the event created exactly the kind of story from which curse legends grow. And the strangest part was that the treasure lost that night was only a fraction of what may have disappeared during the conquest. Because when the Spanish eventually returned and Tenochtitlan fell, one enormous question remained unanswered. Where had the rest of the treasure gone? The treasure that disappeared. The gold lost during La Noche Triste became one of the great treasure mysteries associated with the conquest. But an even larger mystery surrounded the wealth of Montezuma himself. Later traditions described an enormous imperial treasury containing gold, silver, jade, turquoise, precious stones, featherwork, and ceremonial objects accumulated during generations of Aztec rule. Yet when the Spanish finally conquered Tenochtitlan, they did not recover everything they expected to find. That created a question that treasure hunters would spend centuries trying to answer. Had the treasure been hidden before the final siege, or had it disappeared into the waters of Lake Texcoco? Different legends offered different answers. One particularly persistent tradition connected Montezuma's missing treasure with a mountain known as Cerro del Muerto, where the gold was supposedly taken into a cave and hidden behind a collapsed entrance. There is no definitive discovery proving this story, but the legend survived because the possibility was irresistible. If even a fraction of the Aztec treasury had escaped the conquest, somewhere beneath the mountains or buried beneath later cities could be one of the greatest lost fortunes in the Americas. And over the centuries, stories of failed expeditions only added to the mystery. Treasure hunters were said to have encountered illness, accidents, cave-ins, abandoned expeditions, and unexplained deaths. It reveals how the idea of cursed Aztec gold was becoming attached to the search itself. And while some of the treasure may have disappeared forever, enormous quantities of other American gold and silver were already being moved toward the coast. That was when the story of Aztec treasure entered a completely different world. The world of Spanish galleons and Caribbean pirates. When Aztec gold entered pirate waters. After the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, Spain continued extracting enormous quantities of precious metals from its American territories. Gold and silver from Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and other colonies were gathered, refined, and loaded onto ships bound for Europe. The journey was dangerous. Spanish treasure fleets had to cross the Caribbean before reaching the Atlantic, and pirates understood exactly where those ships were most vulnerable. One of the most important areas was the Straits of Florida, where the routes between Cuba, Florida, and the Bahamas created a natural bottleneck. Ships carrying enormous quantities of bullion were difficult to maneuver, especially when storms threatened or when a vessel became separated from its convoy. Pirates did not need to search the entire Caribbean hoping to stumble across treasure. They could wait. They watched for Spanish ships riding low in the water. They watched for damaged vessels and stragglers separated from their fleets. And when a heavily loaded galleon appeared, the gold inside suddenly became the pirates' prize. The important detail is that these pirates were not specifically searching for Aztec gold. They were searching for Spanish treasure. That distinction makes the legend much more believable. A pirate captain could capture a Spanish galleon without knowing whether the gold inside had come from a mine, a royal treasury, or an ancient temple. By the time the metal reached the Caribbean, its original identity could already have been destroyed. A sacred Aztec object could have been melted down in Mexico, converted into Spanish bullion, placed aboard a galleon, and eventually captured by pirates hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The pirate did not have to steal from the Aztecs. He only had to steal from the people who had stolen from them. And once that happened, the gold entered a world where treasure changed hands constantly, records disappeared, and stories traveled faster than facts. That was the perfect environment for a curse to be born, when Spanish treasure became cursed gold. By the late 16th and 17th centuries, the Caribbean had become one of the most dangerous places in the world for a treasure ship. English privateers, French buccaneers, Dutch raiders, and independent pirates all understood the same basic rule. Wherever Spanish treasure traveled, someone would eventually try to take it. Francis Drake demonstrated just how profitable these raids could be when he attacked Spanish treasure routes through Panama in the 1570s. More than a century later, Henry Morgan led a major assault on Panama City, capturing enormous quantities of Spanish wealth. The details of individual pirate fortunes vary between historical accounts, but the larger pattern is undeniable. Spanish treasure was constantly being captured, redistributed, melted down, spent, and stolen again. That constant movement created a problem for anyone trying to trace the original source of the gold. A bar recovered from a Spanish ship might have been produced in a colonial mint, but the metal itself could have passed through many hands before reaching that mint. It could have originated in a mine, been taken as tribute, or been stripped from an indigenous religious object during the conquest. By the time a pirate received it, there was usually no way for him to know. A sacred Aztec object could have been melted down in Mexico, converted into Spanish bullion, placed aboard a galleon, and eventually captured by pirates hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The original artifact would be gone, but the metal would remain. The pirate did not have to steal from the Aztecs. He only had to steal from the people who had stolen from them, the stories that followed the gold. As pirate culture expanded across the Caribbean, stories began circulating about treasure that brought disaster to the people who possessed it. Some tales described crews that captured valuable Spanish prizes only to suffer violent mutinies, deadly illnesses, shipwrecks, or other sudden catastrophes soon afterward. The important thing is that these stories were not necessarily records of a single, identifiable, cursed treasure. They were part of a broader world of maritime folklore in which enormous wealth was frequently followed by betrayal, violence, and death. For sailors living in that world, the connection was easy to understand. A crew could capture a treasure ship and become rich overnight, only to lose men to disease, betrayal, storms, or another pirate attack weeks later. In a profession where death could arrive without warning, almost any disaster could become evidence that the treasure itself was cursed. And once that story was repeated from one port to another, the original event mattered less than the warning that survived it. The gold had acquired a reputation, and that reputation could travel farther than the treasure itself. The curse as a weapon. But there is another possibility that makes the entire legend more interesting. What if the curse was never intended to be supernatural? Imagine a sacred object hidden inside a cave or buried beneath a temple. The people protecting it know that physical defenses will not last forever. A wall can be broken, a guard can be killed, and eventually even a locked chamber can be opened. But fear is different. If generations are taught that anyone who disturbs the treasure will become sick, lose their mind, or die, that warning can survive long after its original guardians are gone. The treasure no longer needs an army to protect it. The fear surrounding it becomes the barrier. And once people believe a treasure is cursed, ordinary misfortune can reinforce the story. An illness becomes evidence. A failed expedition becomes evidence. A shipwreck becomes evidence. The legend did not need to prove itself every time. It only needed to frighten the next person who came looking. And that may be what happened with the stories surrounding Aztec gold. By the time Spanish treasure was moving through the Caribbean, the pirates who captured it had no way of knowing what every piece of metal had once been. They only knew the stories. And if a pirate heard that a particular treasure had already brought death to its previous owners, would he really believe the warning? Probably not, until something happened to him. From lost gold to pirate legend. By the time pirate stories began entering popular literature, the idea of dangerous treasure was already deeply established. Stolen wealth frequently brought betrayal, paranoia, violence, and death in pirate stories because those consequences reflected the real world of piracy. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, helped cement many of these ideas in popular culture. The story did not revolve around Aztec gold, but it presented treasure hunting as a world where greed could quickly turn into suspicion, betrayal, and madness. The connection became even stronger in modern cinema. In 2003, Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl introduced millions of viewers to a very specific version of the legend. Its cursed treasure consisted of 882 gold coins associated with Cortez, and anyone who stole them became trapped in a supernatural state between life and death. The film was fantasy, the skeletons were fantasy, the curse was fantasy, but the basic ingredients were familiar. Spanish treasure, Aztec gold, pirates, greed, destruction, and punishment. Hollywood took these elements and turned them into a supernatural adventure, but the historical world that inspired the atmosphere was already filled with stories about stolen treasure bringing ruin to those who possessed it. And that brings us to the question that matters most. If the supernatural curse was fictional, why does the history of this gold feel so cursed anyway? Because when you follow the treasure beyond the pirate stories, the consequences become much more real. The real curse was worse. If the gold was never actually supernatural, then why does the story feel so much like a curse? Because the deeper you follow the treasure, the harder it becomes to separate the gold from the destruction surrounding it. The Spanish conquest did not simply transfer wealth from one empire to another. It dismantled an entire civilization. Temples were destroyed, religious traditions were suppressed, indigenous books and records were lost, and enormous numbers of people died in the decades that followed. Disease caused much of the population collapse, but conquest, warfare, forced labor, and the disruption of indigenous society created the conditions in which those diseases spread with devastating speed. And the gold was part of that system. Every piece taken from a temple represented something that had been separated from its original world. A ceremonial object could be melted down in minutes, while the civilization that created it could take generations to build. Once transformed into bullion, the object became almost impossible to recognize. Its religious meaning disappeared, but its economic value remained. Then that value traveled. It moved from Mexico to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean to Spain, and from Spanish hands into the hands of privateers and pirates. Every transfer created another opportunity for violence. Crews fought over shares. Captains betrayed their own men. Ships were attacked, wrecked, or swallowed by storms. The strange thing is that the people chasing the gold always believed they were getting closer to freedom. In reality, they were becoming part of the same chain. Cortez is one of the clearest examples. He became enormously wealthy through the conquest, but his later years were filled with disputes over land, titles, money, and his relationship with the Spanish crown. The fortune he helped create did not give him a peaceful ending. Francisco Pizarro followed a similar path in South America. His conquest of the Inca Empire brought him enormous quantities of gold and silver, but the wealth also became part of the violent struggle among the Spanish themselves. Pizarro was eventually assassinated by rival conquistadors in Lima, and the consequences extended far beyond individual conquerors. Spain received an extraordinary flow of American precious metals, yet the wealth did not produce the lasting prosperity its rulers expected. The enormous influx of gold and silver contributed to inflation across Europe, while the Spanish monarchy continued spending heavily on wars, foreign debts, and military campaigns. The crown eventually declared bankruptcy multiple times, so the question changes. Maybe the curse was never attached to the gold. Maybe it was attached to the hunger for it, the treasure that never disappeared. And yet, after 5 centuries, the physical treasure itself has not completely vanished. Some of the gold was melted down again and again, losing every visible connection to the Aztec world. Some became Spanish bullion, some became pirate loot, some was spent centuries ago and disappeared into ordinary circulation. But some treasure was lost before anyone could recover it. The gold that disappeared during La Noche Triste is still part of the mystery surrounding the conquest. So is the treasure supposedly associated with Montezuma's missing treasury. And then there are the Spanish ships. The Caribbean became a graveyard for vessels carrying colonial wealth. Hurricanes, reefs, battles, navigation errors, and pirate attacks sent galleons to the bottom with their cargo still inside. One of the most famous examples is the San Jose, which sank off the coast of Colombia in 1708 while carrying gold, silver, and emeralds. The wreck has become one of the world's most famous lost treasure sites, not simply because of the value attributed to its cargo, but because of the international disputes surrounding its recovery. And that matters to this story for one reason. It proves that the world of lost Spanish treasure was not invented by Hollywood. Ships really did disappear with enormous fortunes. Gold really did cross the Atlantic. Pirates really did attack Spanish treasure routes. And precious metal taken from the Americas really did change hands repeatedly. The mystery lies in how much of that treasure originally came from places like the Aztec Empire, and how much may still be lying where nobody has found it. So, was the Aztec gold really cursed? After everything the gold went through, the question is no longer as simple as whether a supernatural curse existed. The stories may have started as folklore. Pirates lived in a world where sudden death, betrayal, disease, storms, and shipwrecks were part of everyday life. When disaster followed a valuable prize, it was easy for sailors to blame the treasure itself. One story became another, and eventually the gold acquired a reputation that could travel farther than any ship carrying it. But there is another possibility. If sacred treasure was hidden away, a curse could have served a very practical purpose. A warning that anyone who disturbed the gold would die might have protected it long after its original guardians were gone. The treasure did not need an army around it. Fear could do the work. And perhaps that is why the legend remains so compelling. Because even without anything supernatural, the history surrounding the gold is difficult to ignore. It was taken during a conquest that transformed the Aztec world, stripped sacred objects from their original purpose, and turned them into wealth that could be transported across oceans. Once that wealth entered the Spanish treasure system, it became part of a cycle of conquest, piracy, war, and greed that continued for generations. The gold itself did not have to be cursed. The consequences of possessing it may have been enough, and some of the treasure may still be out there, perhaps beneath Mexico, buried or hidden in places where generations of treasure hunters have searched. Perhaps in a forgotten cave whose location survives only through legend. Or perhaps somewhere beneath the Caribbean, inside the remains of a Spanish ship that never completed its journey to Europe. That leaves one final possibility. If a piece of gold were recovered tomorrow and scientists could prove that it had once belonged to an Aztec ceremonial object, it would not prove that the gold was cursed. But it would prove something almost as remarkable. That an object created in the sacred world of the Aztecs survived conquest, melting, Spanish treasure fleets, and centuries of pirate legends, only to disappear and eventually return to the surface. Maybe the curse was never something hidden inside the metal. Maybe it was the story attached to it. A story powerful enough to make people fear the treasure, search for it, fight over it, and keep looking for it centuries after the civilization that created it was gone. And perhaps that is what makes the legend so difficult to bury. The gold may have disappeared, but the story never did.